that was between a small town outside of Perugia called Corciano, 100 inhabitants, and Rome. You know, so it was very much about the diversity of what Italy can actually offer. You know, so that the tiny town and the mega city, and ways in which those are diverse and ways in which those overlap. One of the professors we had there is a guy named Don Hines, and one of the things that I brought with me from my graduate experience is something he always mentioned, which was quoting roughly from Thoreau. He would always talk about how the only ones that get anywhere interesting are the ones that get lost, right? And the necessity of getting lost as an artist, right? And how important that is. And you know, what I found in my experience is that travel is a really great way to get lost, because the second you go anywhere, you're completely lost, right? There is no grounding. And somehow you can't even set up your expectations for it, right? And during my graduate experience, I was presented also with a poem that has sort of brought me forth in a similar light, and it's by a poet named Cavafy. It's a poem called Ithaca. And the poem basically talks about this distant land, Ithaca, which is, you know, all fulfillment, right? You can think of it as heaven, right? Everything comes true there. The streets are paved with gold, and, you know, so on and so forth. All of your imagination is in that place. But the poem talks about how I hope that your trip to Ithaca takes a long time. I hope it takes you forever to get there, and that you're old by the time you get there, and that you've lived all of your life and all of your experiences on the way there, right? And it's about how, you know, you set this distant sight that drives you on the path, but then you don't rush to get there, right? And it's really about the experience of really exploring just what you're doing, right? So that it says, I hope you'll stop on the beaches on the way over and just have a cup of coffee, have a conversation, right? Because sometimes when, especially as artists, we set our paths, we set our sights on a distant land, we have an expectation to get set up that sometimes can let us down when we get there, right? And what Cavafy says is that you will never be let down by Ithaca, because Ithaca provided the trip. It didn't provide anything when you get there. When you get there, that's like not even part of the whole gig, right? And so I always found that to be a really magical way of thinking about the importance of travel, of getting lost, of study, of artistic research, where, you know, the term research in the context of art is a very loose one, right? We can kind of, I tell people all the time, like, they're like, what are you doing? You know, and I'm like sitting, you know, in a church, and I'm just looking, maybe talking to somebody, and I'm doing research. I'm doing research when I step outside of my door and go have a coffee too. You know, that's all part of it, right? And every person I meet becomes a part of that research, right? And so somehow kind of immersing yourself in things and really allowing yourselves to go down paths that are a little bit less traveled and where you absolutely do not know where you're going, right? I think it's a really, really important experience. One of the things that I've become really indebted to, and I'm a teacher in Italy as well, and it's been really interesting because study abroad for me, I studied abroad my junior year in Florence, Italy. It's what led me to actually move there. Studied abroad in grad school, whole time in Italy. And then I've taught for the past 12 years roughly in study abroad. So it's what I know, right? It's like that is my educational experience is study abroad. It's what I have to offer as a professor. And I always tell my students the story of Ithaca. And I'm like, you know, you guys came here, you think you know what you want, you know, but please get lost along the way and get really, really lost, you know. And so I want to touch back out of this Ithaca idea also to kind of, you know, what Greg was saying about the bridges across water, right? It's about taking your time, right? There's no rush to get across the water. You know, explore that pathway. Maybe you can stand and look at the water for a little bit. Why not? You know, and then also kind of think about what Lewis was saying in terms of sort of reflecting upon why you are the person to do things, right? And that's about really thinking about what you bring with you. So when you study abroad, when you go places, right? There's something really curious that happens, in that we're always looking for something of ourselves in our surroundings, no matter how different and strange they are. We're looking for things we identify with, right? And there's ways in which you can kind of create your own identity based on really strange things that have some distant relationship. So I can be reminded of my grandmother looking at a wall in Florence, right? And that's a really abstract thought that wouldn't have naturally occurred, but somehow that construction of your surroundings and making them familiar, right, is another way of getting lost, because what you're really getting familiar with is nothing that's familiar, you know? And so one of the things that I've been doing for the past 15 years roughly, living in Italy, has been about how can I continue to sort of expand my horizons, continue to get lost. I have my own sort of philosophy about what default means, right? And I think as artists, as viewers, as people, there's lots of defaults in our lives, right? Things that just like, I'm gonna go about this like this, right? And I'm really interested in how can you kill all of the defaults, right? And as an artist, I think it's extremely important. Going through grad school, going through undergraduate, a lot of people were on my case pretty drastically about the fact that I was always working on about 20 different projects and everyone was completely different. They were all research, right? And people were like, no, let's develop this body of work, right? And I was like, well, I am. You know, I'm developing that one along with all those other 19, you know? And I didn't have a semester in my mind to resolve that, right? I was like, this is lifetime, guys. I'm setting up my life here, you know? If I follow each of these paths for 20 years, I'm just at the beginning. I'm a baby in this thing, you know? That's a really, really important way to understand creating, right? And it's something that's fed also through not knowing exactly where those things are going to lead you and not knowing where the deadline is, right? There's no closure. Like, there's no climax in creating art, right? We're all just kind of experiencing it. There's these beautiful moments, there's tragic moments, right? And we're just kind of going along, right? And so, you know, the shift in perspective of getting outside of where you live helps with killing the default, because it can't actually be there. When you collaborate with people in different places, be it Texas, be it Spain, wherever it is, things happen that you're not guiding, right? It just happens, right? Even in teaching, I like to think of myself as a coach rather than a teacher. You know, I'm like, let's like think about this thing. Let's go for it here. But I don't know what the thing is. You know, I really don't. And I don't want to know. You know, I want you to find that for me. And so, you know, I've spent one of the more recent experiences, and I'll just share like 2 minutes of this with you, has led me, and I would have never guessed, to Spain. And it originally came out of, I write about 40 to 50 proposals every year. And, you know, probably about 5% of those come out successful. But it's interesting because I don't really say successful when I'm talking about them, because really every one of those proposals for me is setting a new life path, you know. And I do realize different aspects of them whenever it feels appropriate, you know. And so I use those proposals to actually develop new ideas, new work. And because of that, I have like basically endless paths to follow, and I'm still making them, right? So like tomorrow I'll make some new ones, you know, it's just kind of part of the process, right? And so I think it's important not to be let down when you apply for something and you don't necessarily get it, and to think about how that project that you had to really think about and concretize in a certain way is basically ready. It's there, you know, in a way that's very, very magic, right? In a way that it wouldn't be otherwise. And so some of what happened in Spain is that I was reading opportunities, and I read this opportunity to work with an artist named Janice Cunelis, who is one of the founders of the Arte Povera movement, kind of a loose structured movement. It's not really a movement, but sort of. And I had seen Janice speak in Florence, and it was like, you guys have all seen Star Wars, or some version of Star Wars. You know Yoda talks, and it's like, the grammatics of it are weird, and it takes you a while to really understand what the hell he's talking about, because you have to go back and reconstruct the sentence, and then reflect upon it for a while. So Janice, in watching a lecture, was like Yoda. And most of the people were leaving, right? Literally, it was like people were piling out the door. And I was like, how can I be so in love with what this guy does, have an appreciation for the abstraction of that, and not really grasp exactly where he's coming from. I'm curious about this. I'm curious about this. I don't know what it's going to do for him, but I want to work with, I want to know how he's thinking. I want to know what is behind this stuff and how does he talk about it, right? And so I wrote a proposal and I told him that I had seen Janice talking, that I was in love with that talking. It wasn't exactly true, right? But I was curious as hell, right? And they invited me in. And one of the magic things that happens, again, the Ftsca thing, I got there, selected amongst 15 artists to go to Santander, northern Spain, and spend 2 weeks with Janice Canellas creating. And basically, half of each day was Janice talking, right? And he's a philosopher that is like Yoda, like you really have to take some time with it, but it gets you there. But one of the magic things is that every evening, me with these 15 artists would go back to the same apartment, and we would sit down and the conversation would begin. And so we decided at the end of this 2 weeks that this was not the end, and that we needed this kind of energy, we needed this kind of community that was put together. We needed to pick through some of the things that we weren't quite sure about. And so we created a collective. And we've been working together since 2009. So some of what I was going to share with you is a brief sort of 2-minute image to think about this notion of why am I the right person? What do I bring to this, right? And a lot of times when I write proposals, I like to think about not telling somebody what I'm going to do, right? Because I got a decent sense, but I don't really know. I want to get people curious about it. I want people to not know exactly what I'm going to do, but want to know. In the same way that I was thinking about Canellas. I didn't know what the hell he was talking about, but I did want to know. I was very curious. And I feel like when you construct an artist statement, rather than talking about what it is that you're going to do, I'm going to show up, I'm going to start making these plaster molds, and I'm going to cast in this material, install here, work with blah, blah, blah. I think it's more important to talk about the metaphor involved, right? I'm going to talk about, ascension, okay, within the context of military occupation, all right? So that there's abstraction in that thought that people have to kind of deal with, they have to kind of figure out. And a lot of the work that I've done in Spain, following that experience, I won a grant from a foundation in Spain that all of you should look into, called Fundación Botín, Marcelino Botín. And it's a huge granting organization, and they give you money for projects, right? And some of what I proposed 20 projects to these guys, rejected every single time, right? And then I was like, well, maybe I don't have to think about Spain necessarily in proposing this, and I can just think about making work, and they'll be more excited about that. And I did. My project was the only project they had was not Spain, and they were like, yeah, this we want to fund, because there's more me, right? And I was even more abstract than I had ever been in doing this, right? And I'm going to show you just kind of some of the ways in which I'm thinking about Spain through like it's 1 minute and 57 seconds of closing. Basically, in the process of creating things in Spain, again, I'm always looking for what does this have to do with me, right? And in doing so, a lot of times I'm looking at figures that preceded me that are part of what I consider my collective identity. One of those figures that has carried me a very long way is Paul Robeson, right? And Paul Robeson was an African-American activist, singer, actor, right? And he was one of many African-American intellectuals in Spain during the Spanish Civil War that was rallying around global identity, right? He's like, this fight against fascism includes all of us. And to think about somebody going to the front lines as an important actor, singer, artist, today, I was like, that's impossible. Nobody would do that, you know? And so it started to kind of get me thinking about how, and well, in the meantime, experience of creating work that is language-based in a context where the language may or may not be understood. I started thinking about how I could work with abstraction to talk about Robeson, to talk about other figures from the US that had spent time in Spain, Alan Lomax being one of them, folklorists, trying to connect world cultures through folk music. And I did a collaboration that involved a flamenco dancer, 3 professional saxophonists,